Hi, everyone. I'm Marcus Grimm with Medtrics, and today I am joined by Chris Tokodi. Chris is, of course, the CIO of Medtrics. He gets intimately involved with all these projects that we do with our customers. And today we're speaking all about that automated MSPE generation. Chris, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. I appreciate it.
No problem, Marcus. Happy to be here.
Terrific. All right. Well, let's walk through some of the clients that I know we're running automated MSPE first. The first is Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine, MSUCOM. As a well-established osteopathic medical school with multiple campuses, MSU likely had challenges in standardizing those MSPEs across multiple locations. It's a multi-campus structure. Does that complexity impact the implementation of the MSPE module at all?
Well, the good news, Marcus, is not really. So that's actually fairly straightforward in Medtrics, and it has to do with how we structured our evaluations. So that's usually where that comes from, is all these evaluations are happening at different sites. They could be within the MSU system. They could be outside of that system, nationally, internationally. It doesn't ultimately really matter for us, because as long as that is captured in the evaluation and through our automatic evaluation assignments, it always is. So it's based on the schedule. If we know who they are and where they're working, we can deliver that eval. And so that context of what campus they're on or what site they're doing their rotation at always follows that evaluation around. And then because of that evaluation, it'll have that information on the MSPE. So even if they went to the UK to do a rotation, it will say, here's the name of that site at the UK they did it. Here's who did the evaluation. Here's what their comments were. And all that just automatically flows into the MSPE.
Terrific. Now, automated MSPE generation is fairly new. Before Medtrics, how did MSUCOM handle MSPE drafting? What were some of those most significant pain points?
It's kind of like this at most schools before we get involved. It's a very hands-on, slow, kind of piecemeal process. So, walking through it the whole way, there's a lot of data collection that happens basically throughout the whole year. So the same way Medtrics is collecting evaluations, comments from those evaluations, they would have to gather that information somewhere, be it digitally, in some cases not digitally, on paper. And then they would have to gather all that up for a student and then basically manually create their MSPE. There's some tricks that you can use to make that faster, Word documents with mail merge, that kind of thing. But ultimately, a lot of that stuff had to be keyed in. And, one of the troubles with that is it's not always accurate when you're keying in. It's very easy to mess up a date, make that comment sound a little different with a comma in the wrong place, all kinds of stuff like that. And so ultimately, usually in most schools, it's one or just a few persons' job. And it's almost like a year-round job to prepare and then eventually be able to produce these documents.
When we talk about MSPE generation, it of course, at the end, it's the click of a button and it's, wow, look at all that magic that happened. But I know that this is one of those areas where Medtrics it's not just providing the tool, but it's providing the support. What type of training or support strategies prove especially effective when you're teaching people, this is what you were doing and now this is what you're going to be doing?
Well, it can differ. One of the nice things is how integrated MSPE is to the rest of the platform. So there's very little in the way of training that's necessary for MSPE specifically. Basically, the training that we do for scheduling, evaluations, the grade book, all that stuff you're already doing as part of your use of Medtrics, we can just turn that right around into the MSPE module. And other than some setup of the template itself and what words you want to say and where you want Medtrics to paste the information from the grade book, from the evaluations, there's not too much else to it, frankly. And it's all the other things that you're already doing in Medtrics that fill in that MSPE template. And that's why it's relatively easy to get started, especially if you're already using Medtrics.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about admin, because, one of the things that Tosh and I have talked about is MSPE it's a very emotional thing for a lot of our customers. They don't want to create typos. They don't want to create mistakes because this document is so important. When you're introducing people to this tool at MSUCOM, was there nervousness to trust the tool? How did the admins react to the transition? Was it an easy one, or was it, well, trust but verify? What was that like?
Well, I think there's always a level of trust but verify, right? Especially when you're using any new thing. In that particular case, I think it was a little easier because they had already used us and the platform. So, they were kind of used to us. Hey, we can produce results like this. When we say we can do this, kind of magical stuff. We can pull through and we can do that. So I think that trust was already established. But in other cases, when working with clients for the first time, there's definitely a little more hesitation. And a lot of that come with the just basically the siloing of the project, I think, where oftentimes it's one or a very small group of people that do this work. And they're really the only ones doing this work throughout the whole year. And so now that project kind of gets exposed to the greater team. And you can end up with a lot of questions about how do we do this? How do we not do this? And, these are difficult manual processes and mistakes can be made. So that's one of the things that we help with. We're taking that human element out of certain things and making sure that things line up generally how they're supposed to. But it can be a point of contention with teams for sure, as they realize, maybe we weren't doing things the most efficient way. And maybe in order to take advantage of some of these advancements in technology, we should maybe rethink how we're doing certain things. So you just get that kind of, inertia that you have to get over, like with any other project, where you got to do a little convincing to some folks, maybe the folks that directly make those MSPEs. And, maybe they've been doing it that way for 10 years or maybe longer. And now you're saying, well, you could just manage this process, maybe take not even an eighth or a tenth of the time you normally would to manage this process. And it just happens. So, that can definitely seem like a big deal. And so you have to deal with that within your teams. That kind of goes into a general philosophy with Medtrics. It's people first, then process, then technology, right? Because you got to get those elements right before you get to the technology, or else the implementation is not going to be as good as it could be.
Exactly. Now, one of the other schools that you've recently implemented with automated MSP generation is LMU. LMU-DeBusk College of Osteopathic Medicine. That's a relatively newer osteopathic medical school with a focus on rural healthcare. My guess is the administration team there may have even actually been leaner, which could have impacted the onboarding and adoptions. I'm curious, were there any unique challenges that LMU faced in implementing the module compared to larger, more established institutions?
Well, it didn't have much to do with LMU themselves and them being a newer school. That really wasn't the thing there. The thing there is they weren't using Medtrics for the rest of the platform, right? So that we had to deal with a lot of the issues that you run into with just doing this manually. Where is the data? Can the data be trusted? Is it correct? Have there been updates to it? And so all the kind of stuff that we typically just handle through the processes that are in Medtrics were now being done outside of Medtrics. So one of the unique things with that client and other clients that are in that boat where, okay, we're not using Medtrics for maybe we're using for some things, but not all things. So we can't just straight up implement MSPE like other clients that use the whole system can. So then we get into a back and forth about how do we import this data. And, just being frank, a lot of times when you have a third party come in like Medtrics and start looking over your data, we start asking questions that maybe the people there they don't know. A lot of things had changed hands over the years. Like, I've been doing it this way because 10 years ago, someone made a decision and we haven't really looked back at that decision. And so oftentimes that puts us in a position not only as a vendor for a software platform, but also a consultant, right? Because in order for us to deliver a good result in our platform, we have to get that data pipeline working right. And that requires a lot of cleanup in some cases.
It's interesting to me. So LMU literally purchased just MSPE as a standalone module, which I think there's two things that I'd like to unpack there. The first is the idea that MSPE generation is so important that LMU said, let's just buy this as a piece. And the second piece that it speaks to, obviously, is the modularity of the metric system. And I think sometimes we don't talk about that enough, but in many ways, your system is kind of built, I almost think of it as Lego blocks that you can take them and reconfigure them or use some or not use some. What are your thoughts now that you have a client who literally at this point is just using Medtrics just for MSPE?
You made a good point there. Medtrics is relatively modular. I mean, there are some modules that kind of naturally go with some others, right? Well, hey, you got scheduling. You might as well use evaluations because it's just that kind of next step, right? We don't talk about that too much, but it is almost an a la carte system in some ways. depending on what workflow you're trying to work with, right? And MSP can be one of those. We took some liberties with the system to make that happen in a more easy way. Instead of doing evals in a more normal way, we imported the data somewhere else in the database and pulled it in that way. So, our team is also creative with using our own system to solve, workflow problems at our clients. And eventually we want everyone to be on the whole system and using all the integrated workflows that are already in there. But that alone is not a showstopper for any project. As long as your data is in order, we can import it and we can generate an MSPE.
So we talked about MSUCOM, larger institution in the U.S. We talked about LMU, smaller in the U.S. Let's talk about this third one, the Ross University School of Medicine. It's an offshore medical school with a diverse student body and a focus on matching students into the U.S. residency program. Are there any concerns there when you're looking at managing MSPEs at scale while ensuring compliance with U.S. standards? Or again, was that all pretty simple for the team?
In their case, again, they had been using Medtrics for a couple of years at that point for most of what they do at the school. So putting on MSPE on top of that was relatively easy. That one came down to a lot of integrations. And so that's something to consider as well if you're looking at using Medtrics, is we offer integrations with our API and through some other methods as well. And you got to make sure that data is clean too, right? So anytime we do an integration, we kind of kick that off as a project with the client and say, hey, what kind of data can we expect? Here's some thoughts. Here's some questions. Are you validating that? Are you cleaning that up before you send it? Are there discrepancies? Are there overlaps that shouldn't be there? There's a lot of different things in working with those integrations. And it's always fun to look at these databases, which, again, oftentimes have changed hands over the years. A lot of decisions were made a long time ago. And now we have a new team looking at the integration and saying, well, why do we do that? It's almost like a third-party consultant. Sometimes you just need to bring someone in to take a look at a thing. All your expertise is on staff and we know how to deal with this, but no one's able to kind of pull out of their day-to-day view and take a good look at something and question some of the things we're doing.
Right.
And so that's oftentimes where, myself, I'm in an interesting position where I am the vendor, I'm helping you do this, but at the same time, for me to do a good job, I have to look a little deeper and ask questions about things that you might not be used to hearing from a vendor. And that goes to kind of the trust that we build with clients. That is also necessary to be able to have those kinds of conversations and just say, hey, I'm not sure that's what we should be doing. Can we maybe take another stab at that or take another look at that?
Here's a question for you. I think MSPE's been out now roughly a year and a half for Medtrics. I still remember when we talked about it at the first show a year and a half ago or so. Obviously, purchasing decisions take a while in this industry, so now we've got these first handful of case studies. I'm curious for you, whenever you come out with a new feature, you launch the feature, you have certain expectations. Well, we're a year and a half into it. What are some ahas for you? Has it been easier to implement? Has it been more challenging? Have you made a lot of changes to the module? What do you know now that you didn't know a year and a half ago when we said we have this module?
I think on the Medtrics side, it's been relatively easy, but it goes back to what we spoke about earlier, where is the data coming from? If it's already in Medtrics, relatively easy to work with because that's the data we're expecting. We're expecting our own data, so the system knows what to do with it. But if we're needing to do imports, if we're needing to not just do an import, but an actual integration with other platforms, you start asking questions like, okay, what is the source of that data? The source of that data is not the platform that's even sending it to us, because it comes from yet another third party somewhere, something that gets fed into another data warehouse, that gets put into another service that pushes it to us. And so in order to do a good job of actually getting good data in the system to produce a good result, we have to dig in and actually find out what is the source, how is it collected, when is it collected, is it kept up to date, how often is it kept up to date, is that an automated process or a manual one? And so you have to go through and ask all those questions about every piece of data that ends up in the MSPE to be able to actually produce that end result. So there's a lot of lead up time for something like that. And, it's an interesting thing with these projects because a lot of times you just you have the template in the system and you're hoping it's going to work out, but you don't see a lot because a lot of times there has to be a lot of lead up to it. We have to figure out that data, because if I just hit the button, I'm not sure what's going to come out is going to be all that great. So that's why we have to take that deep dive.
Medtrics is both a software and a service vendor. So as you talk about this, what I'm wondering about is if we take LMU for an example, and you talk about creating those perfect data connections, realistically, what does that look like? Is that work that the Medtrics team generally handles all by themselves? Are you working in concert with LMU IT? What does that typically look like? Or are you just giving them the software and saying, hey, figure it out yourself? What's it look like?
Obviously, giving them the software and just making it work, that's just against our philosophy. And also, it means you're probably not going to get a good implementation, and they're not going to get the most out of it that they can. So we really like to be hand in hand with all that, not just with IT too, because one of the interesting things as you deal with clients across the world and handling these situations is sometimes there's disconnects between IT and the administration. And that kind of disconnect comes from the same thing that you have in our world, right? You have domain expertise in IT. That doesn't mean that you have domain expertise in healthcare education. So even though you know what you're talking about in an IT setting, you might not think of the right questions to ask from that domain expertise from healthcare education to be able to get the right implementation in IT, which is kind of where we act as a bridge. Right. So we can speak to the IT team in their language and how we're going to do this integration. Our data warehouse is involved. What kind of SQL queries are we doing? It could be any number of things. But then we could also speak to the domain experts for healthcare education, say, here's why we're doing this. Could we maybe look at doing this way to streamline this process? So bridging that gap is a really interesting thing that we have to do, basically for each client.
Let's talk about ROI on a module like this. It's obvious to me that clicking a button to generate an MSPE would save time. By the same idea, when we talk about saving time, or we talk about giving administrators more ability to focus on the students, these KPIs sound a little bit hand wavy. I'm curious from a KPI standpoint, is there anything that you can extract from Medtrics that's showing you how much faster this is, or is most of the ROI coming from the anecdotal feedback you're hearing from the clients? It sounds like they love it. I'm just curious how they can tell they love it, or what KPIs might exist.
Looking at the Medtrics data itself, MSP happens or it doesn't. So there's not going to be a lot of data in there to be able to say, well, this is how we used to do it and it took this long, and then how here it is a Medtrics and it took this long. So you're not really going to have that. So a lot of it is going to be that kind of less clear, less quantifiable stuff. But, what I was speaking about earlier, where it was usually one or two people's entire job to do this for an entire year. And then usually around the time when it came to actually producing the documents, you tack on a couple more people for a month or two or three to help produce that. So, when you're talking ROI, basically a couple of FTEs, right? And the other nice part about that is usually this is we're already doing the setup in Medtrics if we're using it for the other elements of your program. So tacking on the MSP module makes a lot of sense, especially because those people, it's usually not like there's not enough work to go around. Right. If they're not doing MSPE, they're doing a lot of other things as well that are beneficial for the students and for the school. And so freeing up those people's time to go do that, which is also, I would say, a little more rewarding for them. Not everyone is into pipeline management of data and making sure that the MSPs line up a certain way. That takes a certain personality in itself. I think it's beneficial in a lot of different ways, but it's going to be hard to quantify unless you want to, right? So if you want to do the study and say, well, how much time are we spending in total on generating one student's MSPE, keeping in mind we've probably got a couple of hundred students. So what does that take over the course of a year? How many hours does that take? How much do those people make? What is our opportunity cost for not doing other things that those people could do? And in a lot of cases, maybe want to do more than MSPE. And what does that look like? So if you want to do that study, you got to take a pretty holistic approach, because it could have impacts, beyond what you're thinking. Right? Especially, I think, if you want to think of something like employee retention, right? Happier people tend to stick around. Retraining people costs money. So if you're able to make their job easier and more rewarding by having them do less, more monotonous work and more interesting work, I think that can be a very high ROI, even though it might be a little difficult to actually quantify.
Right. Really well said. Final question for you today is, from your perspective, this feature done? Are there major improvements you anticipate bringing out in the next several weeks or months, or how are you thinking about this feature right now?
With Medtrics, the philosophy is what is done. Probably nothing. As a company, people stop asking for stuff, it'll be done, but that never happens. Right? So there's always something more to do. MSPE, I feel, is in a really good place, but we also have to keep in mind changes in the industry. So, a lot of our clients, they use more or less a template that was created by the AMC. Here's the kind of standard thing we want to do. When a program director reads it, they understand it. It's in the same format for most schools. There's benefits to that, but there's also benefits to sticking out, right? So I think what you might end up seeing is folks that are using the template might start doing things a little differently to have their students stick out. And so what does that mean? I'm not sure yet. We'll talk to those clients and we'll see what their needs are. And then most likely we'll find a way to do it because that's how we built the company, right? It's just talking to folks and asking them, what do you need? How can we help? And then working through the technology side of that.
Terrific. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Marcus.
Hey, everyone. MSPE generation. It's one of the things that we always hear about when people come up to the Medtrics booth at trade shows. It is something that administrators and coordinators are tasked with. That is a very important task. As Chris said, it's a time-constrained task, and there's a lot of emotional baggage that goes along with it. And with the new automated MSPE module from Medtrics, we're hoping that we can help alleviate some of that burden and keep you on those high-value tasks that you have available. Chris also mentioned doing studies. There's actually a study going on right now at Medtrics that you can participate in and let us know how much time the MSPE module is saving you. And also on the website at medtricslab.com, there's even a brand new resource download all about the MSPE. We encourage you to read that at your convenience. For everyone at Medtrics, I'm Marcus Grimm.